Hello and welcome to the third in this series of public lectures hosted by the Carmichael Centre here in North Brunswick Street in Dublin. The lectures are being held to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the centre and are being recorded by Dublin City FM before a live audience. Today's guest speaker is author, literary critic and columnist Fintan O'Toole. And here to formally introduce Fintan and to tell us a little about the Carmichael Centre, would you please welcome the Centre's CEO, Diarmuid O'Toole.
Good evening and welcome, and thank you for coming. This is our third in the series of the lectures. My name is Diarmuid O'Toole. I'm the Chief Executive of the Carmichael Centre. I see some faces that have been at the other lectures, but some of you probably don't know a whole lot about Carmichael Centre. We're going 25 years this year. We're the first and the largest shared facility for not-for-profit organisations. Today we have 48 different charities and non-profit organisations based here in the centre. This is where they operate out of them. They get the support from each other, which is very, very powerful when you're in a small organisation to talk to others that are going through similar problems. But also, there's a backup structure here in the centre. We provide accounting and payroll services, IT support. We also provide training and capacity building supports here in Carmichael for the members, but also for groups and organisations all around the country. So a very, very important resource. And part of the thing we said for the 25 years is to let more people know about Carmichael, because a lot of people have said, I don't know what Carmichael Centre does. I've seen this building. I don't know what's in there. And it's an opportunity for people to come and see the building. They may learn a little bit about Carmichael Centre, but also hear some very good speakers. And as I said, we've had two already with Sister Stan and John Lonergan. And tonight we have Fintan O'Toole. And to say Fintan is accomplished is an understatement. When you look at what Fintan does and what he's achieved, it's mind-boggling when you think about it. He's an author, a literary critic, columnist. He's also a visiting lecturer in Princeton University. He's a person that's very passionate and cares, and he's very, those that follow his columns get sort of inspired every Tuesday, and we'll see another bastion of humbug in Irish society being taken apart so coherently and so well and so right, because he calls it, and a lot of times it needs calling. And Fintan has been a lone voice during the Celtic Tiger years, and now as we go through the boom and coming out of into recession and back out of recession again, there are still quite fundamental things wrong with Irish society, and we're lucky to have somebody like Fintan that can raise it and hold people to account. It takes a very brave person to expose humbug, and one of the things he exposed one time was criticising the exorbitant pay rates that are in Irish society, and he held out his then editor as an example of system gone wrong in terms of in unjustifiable pay rates that people have felt that they're entitled to. Fintan has also been a very good friend of Carmichael Centre down through the years, and then we've asked Fintan for help. He has gladly given that help. About nearly 2 years ago, a number of organisations that benefit from a scheme called the Scheme to Support National Organisations. Not many people would know about it, but those that know about it and depend on it is a critical scheme to support small organisations, national organisations. And an awful lot of them had lost their funding suddenly, and it had a huge dramatic impact on those organisations, and when they lose, and some of them were facing closure. A number of the organisations are based here in Carmichael Centre, and I remember we had a meeting, what we were going to do, how we were going to raise the issue, and somebody said, maybe Fintan O'Toole might do something. I contacted Fintan. He was on holidays down in Clare. He took my call. He said, give me a call back on Saturday and we'll talk. I did a brief conversation with him on the telephone, and on Tuesday it was one of the most articulate articles that, I said, well, that wasn't me, that's Fintan's skill at being able to very, very clearly put the case, highlight the injustice of what had happened. And that's just a typical example of the things that Fintan does on a daily basis. So we're delighted to have him. When we were doing the series, it was one of the first names I put on my list. I said, who I'd like to come here and talk. And so without any further ado, I want to hand over to Fintan.
Thanks very much, Dermot. I'm afraid I'm going to be a great disappointment after that wonderful introduction. But it's a real pleasure to be here in the Carmichael Centre. I have enormous admiration for what the Centre does, and it's a brilliant model of the way in which scarce resources, and they are very, very scarce, can be multiplied by human contact, by good organisation, by good leadership from people like Dermot. And as Dermot mentioned, people sharing their experiences and the strength that comes out of that is very inspiring. Dermot asked me to talk about civil society in Ireland, really, and the relationship in a way between the state and civil society. And in thinking about this, it occurred to me that we're, at the moment, of course, we're very much in a process of reflecting on what we always talk about as the creation of the state. You know, when we think about 1916, we talk about a state coming out of 1916. We don't talk about a society coming out of 1916 and out of that period of the Irish Revolution, for want of a better phrase. And if you stand back, this is actually quite odd. Maybe in one way it's a tribute to the dramatic power of violence. When you think about how does change happen, obviously people with guns have a glamour to them, have a force to them, have a power to them, and sometimes they make a difference, as clearly happened in the Irish case. And so we tend to focus very much on specific events, the 1916 Rising itself being by far the most dramatic of those. And quite rightly, we will mark that next year, and we will hopefully use it as a way to try to think about what kind of place we have become. But the odd thing is that we actually don't think about the fact that before there was an Irish state, there was an Irish civil society. And in many ways, we live with two different streams of change. We have a stream of change which came out of all the political ferment and created in the end a state. Okay, a state that a lot of people were not happy with, but it did create a state, and we're very grateful and very glad that we have an independent state. And that was achieved. But in a sense, there was another stream of change which was already underway long before the 1916 Rising happened. An independent civil society was being formed in Ireland. But how do you become independent? You have to become independent mentally before you actually become independent politically, right? In a sense, the creation of a state is the culmination of a process rather than the beginning of a process, or at least should be. And if you look at it historically, the great achievement of Irish independence, you could argue, and I'm being slightly provocative here, but let's be a bit provocative. Let's say the great achievement of Irish independence actually wasn't the creation of a state. It was the creation of a civil society. If you think of Irish society after the famine, one of the greatest catastrophes proportionally that's happened in any society, and you think about the consequences of the famine, not just in terms of the trauma, the enormous costs, human cost, but also in terms of course, the mass migration that it gives an enormous boost to. So you have a society that's in many ways bleeding away. You know, this is a society whose population is falling catastrophically even after the famine. Millions and millions of people are disappeared from the Irish landscape, either through death or through migration. And it is, you know, it's still remarkable for us to remember this, that we are one of the very, very few, I think probably the only country in the world whose population has still not recovered to what it was in 1841. You know, it's absolutely extraordinary when you think about the population of the island now being, somewhat over 6 million. In 1841, it was 8.5 million. You know, there's no other society anywhere that's like that, and so you get a sense of this kind of demographic collapse, which is really very, very profound, and it's a process of collapse which would continue for a long time. I mean, by the late 1950s, when I was born, that was kind of a rare thing. I mean, another person joining our society was rare enough. The population was dropping towards 2 million. I mean, very, very small population indeed. And that process, in a way, must have been an incredibly traumatic process and an ongoing long-term process that was already underway. And how did Irish society respond to that catastrophe? Well, actually, Irish civil society responded in extraordinary ways. The civil society that we kind of take for granted in Ireland now was largely created from 1880, 1890, the turn of the century. From that period on, if you like, the pre-revolutionary period is the one in which Irish civil society really comes into its own And it becomes, as I said, an Irish civil society. It's not just a part of the United Kingdom. It's not just a part of the empire. It is very specifically a society which is voluntary, which is connected, which is local, and which is about our collective capacity as Irish people. Before you get the 1916 Rising, you get the Irish trade union movement, for example, which is formed and founded and struggled for over those years, often in extremely bitter ways, culminating, of course, in 1913. You get the Irish feminist movement. You get the movement of Irish women demanding the vote, demanding equality. You get the agricultural cooperative movement, which had a huge impact on the Irish countryside and on rural society. You get the Gaelic Athletic Association, one of the most extraordinary voluntary organisations that's ever been created. Probably still the most remarkable voluntary amateur sporting organisation in the world. You get Conradh na Gaeilge, the Gaelic League, setting out, you could argue about how successful it was in the end, but setting out to preserve and strengthen and re-establish the Irish language as the vernacular language of the country. You get the Abbey Theatre and the literary movement. You get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different organisations, artistic, social, economic, political organisations being formed in this country and coming into their own in those decades. And you could argue, in a way, and again, I am being a bit provocative about this, but you could almost argue that even if we'd never broken with Britain, we would have had a kind of independence, because we had independent organisations that mattered enormously in the daily lives of almost every Irish person. There were very few people in Ireland who were not members of at least one and sometimes dozens of these organisations, people who were actually participating in this great civic awakening. And to some extent, I would argue that the political change that happens is an expression of that change rather than something that's kind of extraneous to it. I think we tend to see the big changes are the changes that are made through violence and through those acts of rebellion. I would argue that the big changes are already underway, and they're social. They are changes to do with the emergence of Irish civil society. And this raises then an interesting question, right, which is, if Irish civil society was already in this state of ferment and energy and creativity before the Irish Revolution and before the foundation of the state, what happens when the state's founded? If you were to have looked at it in the abstract, I think, if you took the temperature of the place in 1898, so to take a date, and looked around you, you would have said, something has awoken in this society. There are people who are fighting back in all sorts of ways against an enormous social trauma. They are forming new kinds of affinities, new kinds of connections. And if these people ever do get an independent state, it's going to be a state that's going to be really very strongly citizen-based. It's going to have enormous potential for participation because you've already got that. Surely the kind of state that's going to emerge out of this is going to be very much a participatory state. And yet, when we look at it, it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like the state that we got out of the Irish Revolution was a state that actually fully represented the creative energies that had gone into creating this independence of mind in Ireland that was already there. And so I think as part of this process of the decade of commemorations and reflecting on what happened to us and are we the way we wanted to be, I think this question of the relationship between the state and civil society is not an abstract one at all. It really goes to the heart of the energies that we had, the energies which we still have, but also the fact that our state has never seemed fully to be responsive to those energies or to represent them. I think it would be broadly agreed by most people that we have a state which seems very often to operate under its own steam, seems to operate as a set of institutions, as a set of bureaucracies, as a set of systems of power, but often seems quite impervious to civil society. And not just sometimes impervious to civil society, but at times even inimical to civil society. Right? And so it's worth just trying to tease out a little bit about why that happened, what its consequences might be, and most importantly, what could we do about it? Are we stuck with this? There is this paradox, that we have fabulous participatory, democratic, voluntary organisations, and we have a state which doesn't seem to reflect that ethos. And yet we are a democracy. We can't say, well, it's not like it was before. We can't say, well, that's the British for you. That's the imperial structures over there in London, which are refusing to respond to our democratic wishes, to our society, to our culture. we did get a state, and we do own it. We do elect the people who control the state. And so it takes some explaining as to why this disjunction seems to be there. I suppose the first reason is, let's not be naive about it. That's what states do. All states in some form or other acquire a sense of their own interests, right? Simply, if you set up any set of structures, they have power, they have ways of doing things, and they will, almost automatically over time, they'll acquire a sense of us and them. They'll think, well, actually, we're the people who really understand what's going on. We're the people who control the money. We're the people who have to be responsible. And those people out there are just problems. They're just making demands on us. They're getting in our way. And we have to withstand them. We have to withstand those pressures. So states tend to do that anyway. Right? So to some extent, what happened in Ireland is not unique. But I think the extent of it is nevertheless particularly strong. And so we can't just explain it by saying, well, that's what states do. Other states, and particularly other small countries that got their independence, that modernized around the same time that we did, ended up doing this stuff a lot better. Right? They don't necessarily have the same extent of the idea of a very centralized state with all of this control. They do have a much stronger sense of participation and a much stronger sense of the role of civil society. So it's not enough just to say that that's the way states do. I think we have to look for more specific explanations. One of the explanations is violence itself. Right? And I'm not here to say, well, wasn't it terrible that there was violence in our revolution? I mean, there's been violence in every revolution. The revolutionaries didn't invent violence in our society or in the empire, for God's sake. The Irish Revolution, of course, coincides with one of the most abysmally violent periods in human history, the First World War. So this isn't a kind of moral statement about, wasn't it terrible that Pearson Connolly took to violence? There was probably an inevitability about the fact that was going to happen. But violence has consequences, as we know. Whether it's justified or unjustified, it does certain things. And one of the things is, in our society, of course, is it was enormously divisive. Right? So you had existing divisions, which were very, very strong in our society, of course. Particularly the division between those who wanted an independent state and those who didn't. So you had those religious, ethnic, sectarian divisions, which were also political divisions. We know we're still living with those, with the consequences of them. And again, I'm not here to say, partition was a terrible thing, or that's not the point. And, it's what happened. It's what happened. But again, it has consequences. So both the violent nature of the Irish Revolution and partition, which was somewhat a product of that violence, has consequences for the way the state operates, right? A state that comes out of massive social division is likely to be a more defensive, paranoid kind of state, right? So it's not one that has evolved nicely out of the organic growth of civil society, right? It's one that actually has come out of these, in themselves, very traumatic, very contested, very bitter sort of circumstances. And our state did. And again, this isn't about blaming anybody for that. It's the way our history unfolded. But there are two obvious consequences of that. One is that you get the Civil War. You get a state being set up in very literally embattled circumstances, right? So the first Irish governments are literally meeting under armed guard. For a lot of the time in the very first meetings of the cabinets of the Irish Free State, there are times when they're not allowed to even go outside the door of the buildings they're meeting in because it's too dangerous. There's people out there trying to shoot them. And people trying to shoot you does tend to make for a kind of somewhat centralised, defensive, inward-looking ideas of government, of ideas of how it's going to work. So partly what you got then was a response to that sort of very violent circumstances of the birth of the state, which is a state which stresses its unity, its lack of sympathy for troublemakers, its lack of sympathy for divisiveness, its tendency to see anybody who's outside the circle as being a problem. All those kind of attitudes get built in. Another consequence, of course, was that they had to set up a bureaucratic structure very quickly, right? And legal structures. So coming out of this sort of very, very disturbed period in the society, you suddenly have to have a civil service, you have to have law courts, you have to have all the bureaucracy of a state. And again, and I'm not blaming anybody for this, but in a way the natural thing to do is to say, well, take it off the shelf. We don't have time, we're under too much pressure, we can't rethink it. We can't think about what kind of society do we have? What kind of civil society do we have? What are the great strengths of our society? Look at all these fabulous voluntary groups. Look at all this energy that we've got. How do we actually create a democracy that might reflect that, might use it? No, you don't do that. You say, okay, who's around here who knows how to run a country? Right? And mostly it's British people from the old British civil service, right? So you just take the imperial models and the imperial personnel. I mean, literally most of the people who go into the Irish civil service to run the country are just transferring over from the old imperial system. Similar kinds of stuff happens in a lot of the institutions, you know. And again, this is not about blaming anybody. This is just the way our history happened. In those circumstances, under that kind of pressure, with a civil war, it was the easiest thing to do. The natural pressure was to do that. But what it did was it foreshortened our process of state formation, right? So we're not, you know, we look at countries like Denmark or Sweden and we say, God, we wish we had sort of states like that, which were much more decentralized, much more localized, much more comfortable with the idea that actually you don't need necessarily a huge, enormous, big bureaucratic state in your capital which runs everything. But they came out of peaceful processes and they had time to think about what kind of structures they would want. And ours didn't. And the tragedy, as we know, is that stuff that gets put in at the beginning, the DNA of a state, particularly the DNA of institutions, is very hard to remove. You know, it's very hard to kind of reverse engineer a state once you've set it up. So we got essentially a kind of localized version of an imperial state, you know, which was very highly authoritarian, very hierarchical, very defensive, also very self-assured. I mean, these people are used to kind of running bits of an empire, you know, so they have a sense that actually we know what we're doing. There's a culture of expertise, of a kind of technocracy that's already set in. I mean, I suppose a culture of administrative self-esteem, shall we say, which has never gone away. It's never gone away. There's always a sense that we know best and you're the problem. And this, as I said, was pretty much built in, I think, from the start, and we found it very, very difficult to shake it off. The second thing that happens out of the circumstances of nation state, which is because of this other divisiveness, because you get partition, you also get then a sense of a very monolithic culture, right? So if you had somehow managed, and we didn't, and maybe, again, this was inevitable, but if you'd somehow managed to create a united, independent state, it would have had to have been a state that had pluralism and diversity built into its DNA. Because we've had to say, we've got a problem here on this island. We have at least two, you know, major traditions. We have people who don't see eye to eye. We have people who, you know, were very reluctant about Irish independence. So therefore, what do we have to do? We have to have systems of governance, values in terms of the way we operate that are very careful about the idea that there's not one right way, that there's not a sort of monolithic view of what Ireland is, of how it should work, of how processes should operate. And that imagined state would have had to be one that was much more comfortable with the idea that, actually, you know what, there are contradictions, there are arguments, there's discourse, there's debate. And by the way, these are not the problem. These are your energy. These are the things out of which ideas come, out of which creativity comes, out of which, after all, you know, as I've been arguing, the whole ferment of the Irish state came out of people arguing. It came out of people who were you know, fully engaged in pointing their fingers and shaking their fists and making arguments and setting up things and agitating and creating and writing and doing all that kind of stuff. So a pluralist democracy, had it been possible, would have had to be much more comfortable with the kind of civil society that we already had. But, you know, James Connolly famously said that partition would create a carnival of reaction on both sides of the border, and of course he was right. And again, this is not about whether partition was inevitable or not. It happened, and it did create a carnival of reactions. So what you got then were two states or statelets which had a very strong sense of their own identity and relatively little patience with the idea of pluralism, diversity, openness, inclusiveness, all of those kinds of things. You didn't need them. You know, you had a Protestant state for Protestant people. Our diversity is up there. It's the other side of the border. And their diversity, their other, was down here. Or, of course, tragically, within Northern Ireland, the Catholic population of Northern Ireland ceases to exist in official terms. So between them, these two forces, right, the sort of the violence of the foundation of the state, the civil war, the urgency of just setting up a state and taking one off the shelf, and this lack of an energy of pluralism and diversity. Between them, I think those two forces created a sense that you were going to get a state that was very highly centralized, that was very much a sort of top-down command structure, command and control, and that saw itself as being in the business, really, of managing society, managing the economy, managing Ireland. Many of the people who did this and have done it throughout the history of the state have done it with absolutely the best of intentions. We've had people who've given their lives to doing their very best to try to pursue the common good, to try to make Ireland a better place, and in some cases they have succeeded. So this isn't knocking civil servants or public servants, or knocking even politicians or government. There have been extraordinary initiatives that have been taken at times, but the overwhelming culture of the state has been a managerial culture. It's very, very striking, that when you look at the big developments in the state, the radical ones, first of all, you find that they're very few and far between. How many big ideas has the Irish state had since it was founded? I mean, really big ideas, really sort of game-changing ones that say we've got to really rethink things. Very, very few. You could say that social housing in the 1930s was a game-changer. And it was a big idea. And it's one we could very well do with revisiting. Isn't it shameful for us that in the 21st century, with vastly more resources, we apparently can't build houses for people who need them? In the 1930s, in a vastly poorer, more constrained economy, it was possible to do these things. Well, that was one very big idea. Electricity, starting with Ardnacrusha, with the ESB, the idea that you would electrify the whole country, big idea, big game changers in terms of society. But they are what they have in common is, right. I would say free secondary education, for example, was a huge one. And of course, the whole idea of opening up the country to, I suppose, duty free would be an example. It was that broader idea, that the sort of Mass-Whittaker idea. That is a huge idea. You can argue about all of its consequences, whether they're all good, but certainly most of them were positive, and it transformed the society by opening up Ireland to multinational capital and investment and getting rid of the protectionist economy. But the fact is, we could probably count big ideas, big moments on one hand. When you look at those ideas, overwhelmingly they come from the kind of top-down ideas, right? So they come from very enlightened, very progressive, very energetic people within the system thinking, we've got to do this. And then we sort of try to organise to get it done. It's very hard to point to a moment transformative moments in the structure of the state, the way the state operates, the way the economy works, the way the society works, that has come from the bottom up, with the exception of feminism. I would suggest the only major, until perhaps something like the same-sex marriage referendum this year, but in terms of the broad history of the state, very, very few large-scale movements that sort of start outside the state, work their way inwards and have big effects in terms of government policy, in terms of the way the state operates. And it takes a very long time for those things to operate. Even with feminism, one of the things, for the first half of the state, of course, it spends its time rolling back the feminist energies of the Irish Revolution. Most of the women who were involved in 1916 were also involved in campaigning against the 1937 Constitution because they were absolutely disgusted by it. Absolutely disgusted by it. And again, it was maybe a matter of luck. The one leader of 1916 who emerged into a dominant position in the state, Eamon de Valera, the one sort of leader of a garrison as such, was also the only one who wouldn't have women in his garrison. In many ways, the 1916 is very, very progressive in gender terms. There's a lot of women who are in very prominent positions and who are very much not just sort of making the tea and bandaging the wounds, but are political players. And of course, that gets written out of the history of 1916. It gets written out of the way the place works. Feminism does become one of the things that sort of shapes the state, but after a very long and very difficult struggle, and certainly not in any kind of straight line, where the state takes the founding energies and carries them through. So what you get, I think, is a state, arguably, that becomes increasingly distant from the energies of civil society. And the remarkable thing in many ways is that civil society kind of carries on regardless. So it's not then that the energy of our civil society completely dissipates. It doesn't go away. But it becomes, in a sense, used to operating almost on the fringes of the state, of trying desperately to influence the state, trying sometimes to get some state resources, trying to make kind of policy suggestions or arguments, but largely in an oddly marginal position. And I would suggest that what you get is a kind of rough, and this is very rough, but nevertheless I think it's useful, a kind of rough division, which is at national level, you have a highly centralised state, which doesn't really respond to civil society. And then the gap at local level is filled by civil society to a large extent. In communities, in people's sense of their local identity is very much tied up with the voluntary sector, with voluntary organisations, with community organisations, with civil society in the broad sense. So you get this, and of course this is not completely an absolute division, but I think broadly speaking it is true. And so you get this kind of very odd division. And it's almost as if at times Ireland operates in two completely different ways. So it operates at a local level in a way that often is, in fact, very participatory, very engaging, very much full of the energy of civil society. And then it operates at a national level as if civil society doesn't exist at all, or exists only as an irritant to be controlled or fobbed off or kept away from the machinery of power where it could only do damage because these people wouldn't really know what to do with money and power. This ultimately is a very, very unhealthy relationship. It's an unhealthy relationship from both sides of the coin. It's unhealthy for the state because, as we know, what we then get is a state which becomes, in a sense, very self-reflecting. One of the phrases that came out of the banking crisis was groupthink. The banking crisis, in a way, was one of the ultimate expressions of a state that really talks to itself, that is deeply enclosed, highly self-assured, very much committed to models of managerialism, and which really doesn't think actively outside of its own boxes. I mean, it's very reluctant to accept that there might be people out there who might have important things to say and who might actually know more than the state knows. There might be people delivering healthcare services, for example, who know more about healthcare than the state does. There might be people running schools who know more about education than the state does. There might be people trying to hold communities together who know more about what it takes to hold a community together than the state does. At all sorts of levels, that kind of perception just doesn't really operate. And what you get is a state which is saturated in groupthink at all sorts of levels. I mean, it sort of makes certain assumptions about how things operate, and it stays very much within those. But it's not just, of course, groupthink. It's also who is the group. If you don't have a state which is responsive to broader civil society, who is it responsive to? Because what it will be responsive to is to influential organizations and individuals who are not essentially part of civil society. So our state gets very, very corrupted. Because this sort of circling of the wagons, this kind of centralization. Another word for that kind of centralization is a phrase for it is lack of accountability. If it's not open, it's not accountable. And if it's not accountable, it becomes corrupted. This will be true of every possible society or every possible set of organizations. There's nothing at all uniquely Irish about the corruption of politics. But we have had it in a particular kind of way, I think. And it certainly has been facilitated and enhanced by the idea that the state is cut off from civil society and is therefore unaccountable and unresponsive. It becomes far easier to get your way with public resources if those public resources do not, in a real sense, belong to the public. If the state sees those resources as belonging to itself, it can therefore justify the making of all sorts of decisions in the public interest. One of the very odd ironies of Irish official language is if you ever see the phrase "in the public interest," it almost certainly isn't. It's one of those phrases that is used continually, and it generally means that the state is doing something appallingly cruel to somebody weak. And the public interest is also used then to justify allocation of resources to people who are already powerful and who can support the political parties, who can support the system, who can, in some cases, literally support the lifestyles of politicians. So that is one of the consequences, I think, of this divide. As I said, it's bad for the state. It's particularly bad for a state that calls itself a republic. The term republic, as we know, because we repeat it to ourselves endlessly because we know we don't have it, but it comes from res publica, the public thing, the public's thing, the thing that belongs to the public. It's another word for civil society. It's another word for a state which is owned by the ferment of the citizenry, and not a thing in itself that seems to take to itself its own powers, its own priorities, and its own sense of self-importance. And our sense that we don't really have a republic, I think, is very highly related to the fact that there is this division between the state and civil society. Now, just as it's bad for the state, though, I think it's also bad for civil society. Why is it bad? Well, okay, there are some aspects of our civil society which are capable of operating pretty much outside the state, although nobody ever entirely does. But the GAA, for example, doesn't necessarily depend on the state for its validity, for its capacity to operate. But by and large, I mean, most aspects of Irish civil society, most voluntary organisations actually need a supportive state. They need to be in a dialogue with the state. They need somebody listening. They need a sense that they're valued. They need a sense that they are, critical parts of the way in which the common good is delivered. And if you don't have that, I think then, of course, also, what does it do? It makes civil society very embattled. It makes civil society organisations very much tending to try desperately to take care of their own patch, quite understandably. Often they're very much in the business of survival, so they tend to look inwards about how can we fulfil the particular mandate that we have, how can we get some resources, how can we keep going, and tend therefore to be conflicted about their relationship to the state. I think if you talk to most voluntary groups, they have a very, very uneasy relationship with the state. In general, the voluntary sector in Ireland, I think, has tended to feel angry about the state, because very often voluntary groups are at the front line of seeing the damage that bad state decisions do, or the damage that neglect of vulnerable citizens does. But at the same time, they're very dependent on the state. And they're very concerned about alienating the state, and particularly alienating officials. Now, that in itself should ring alarm bells. If in a democracy, voluntary groups are worried about the fact that they shouldn't upset the state, it sort of makes you wonder what's the order of priorities here. Surely the state should be worried about upsetting citizens and not the other way around. But the reality is that because voluntary groups often experience state decisions as being arbitrary, as being unpredictable, as being taken in ways that are very difficult to discern the logic of, therefore there's a certain kind of fear of the state on behalf of a lot of organisations within civil society. And sometimes it's a justified fear. Diarmuid mentioned in his introduction the very, very minimal state scheme for national organisations that largely operates here in Carmichael House. Just look at the arbitrary way in which those tiny, fragile organisations who do incredible amounts of decent work for the common good, and usually for people who are particularly vulnerable, just look at the way the state could turn around and say, by the way, we're cutting off all your funding. Just like that. No need to undergo any real process, no need to undergo any deep explanation for why this was done, any rationale, any sense of accountability for the decisions being made. any sense of being responsible for the consequences. Nobody turning around saying, we're cutting off your funding, but we're going to do X, Y, and Z because we think it's better. Just simply saying, we're not doing this anymore. A state that can operate in that way is a state that's in trouble. Now, this is where this relationship, where you have civil society organizations who have a reasonable grounds for being worried about how the state's going to treat them, and you have a state that thinks it can operate like that. That's where you see that both sides of this actually become somewhat distorted. These often may seem like small things. It may seem, other than to the people who are directly affected, what does it matter if the Huntington Society is cut off? It's only a small number of people, who cares? Well, actually, it matters enormously. Of course, it matters in terms of social justice and humanity and decency in a society. But it also matters because the kind of state that can thoughtlessly do things like that is actually a state that's in trouble. It's a state that really isn't responsive to its citizens, to their needs, but also to ways of operating that are accountable. The problem in all of this kind of decision-making is a lack of accountability, a lack of rationale, and a lack of decent thought about how public resources should be used. What we find in the Irish state as it currently exists is a set of institutions which have become highly sclerotic. And you would have thought that the crisis we've been through would have shaken those institutions to their very core and would have really radically changed the way in which they operate. And there has been some change. There has been some positive change. But by and large, the state has proved pretty much impervious even to its own crises. Just think about some of the very basic things that a state does, for example. One of the things we all know the state does, and we pay attention to the state once a year when the budget's coming, right? Because we want to see what the budget contains and what its effects for us might be. There was a report produced a couple of weeks ago by the OECD, the Organisation for European Cooperation and Development, which represents the entire developed world, really. And they do these reports occasionally. They've been looking at kind of budgetary processes in different parliaments right around the world. And they just kind of said, in the Irish case, we've never seen a parliament that has less involvement in budgets than the Irish one. We've just never seen this before. It's like nothing like it anywhere in the developed world. We have the weakest parliament in the developed world, and weak in senses that matter. People say, oh, well, we don't care if the parliament's weak because we don't want puffed up politicians. Well, actually, they're supposed to be representing us. This is the point. There's supposed to be systems within the state that are there to engage in scrutiny on behalf of the public. Why, for example, does the state not produce with every budget a statement, a detailed statement of what the social effects of this budget are going to be? It's not some radical idea. What are the distributional effects of the budget? Who's getting what money? How is this going to affect different groups in society? The state doesn't do that. If you ever look at the budget, it produces usually kind of 6 examples, which are kind of usually carefully chosen of, John and Mary live in a house in Ballantyre, and then somebody else, and it gives you some very broad sense of how these individuals might be affected. But it doesn't engage in any real analysis. Now, a very interesting point about this is that Michael Noonan was actually asked about this in the Dáil Finance Committee about a year ago. And he was asked, would it not be a good idea? It's almost embarrassing that we're asking, would it not be a good idea for the state to produce with the budgets, or maybe even before the budget, detailed analysis of what the effects of the budget is going to be on society? And he said, we don't really have time to do that. We're very busy. We're really very busy. Officials are very busy. They've an awful lot to do coming to a budget. They couldn't be really doing that sort of thing. But then he said, and this is a very interesting thing, he said, but anyway, the voluntary groups do that work. Right? So this is where you get this very, very distorted relationship between civil society and voluntary groups. So what the state's actually saying is, you know what, it's not really our job to care about social justice or the effects of how we raise and spend money. It's your job out there in the voluntary sector. We may be cutting off your funding, so you may have no resources to do any of this work anyway, but somehow the state hives off its conscience to the voluntary sector. So it actually says out there is where all of these questions need to be examined and scrutinised and debated. In here, we get on with the job of governing the country. And so you have this weird kind of division between the management of public resources on the one side, the governing of the country with all that power that implies, and the thinking about the consequences. It happens somewhere else. And the analysis, the argument, the sense of what's actually happening on the ground is meant to happen somewhere else. And you would say that this gets filled in, of course, there should be something in between these two, which is politicians that we elect to mediate in many ways between their communities and the state. That's what their job is. But in fact, of course, what they don't do is exactly that. What they mediate is between individuals in their constituencies who have votes and the state. So our politicians have formed a way of operating which is not actually to do with thinking about what does my community need, what do they want me to do. It's about sort of atomizing each individual within that community and saying, what's your problem? I can fix your problem if you vote for me. But each problem is then individualized and atomized and taken down to that level. Problems are not seen as being communal, collective and social. They're seen as being individual problems. It's remarkably interesting, isn't it, that we call the meetings that TDs have clinics. Like, they're the doctor, you're the patient. You're sick, it's your problem, and I can fix it. I can fix you. We have a medical model for doing our politics, which is actually, I think, the ultimate outcome of this lack of connection between the state and civil society. So finally, the questions arise then about, I think we've some sense of how we've got here, of how these systems have become built in, but what do we do about them? And can we do anything about them? Well, the good news is we can. We're in a period, I think, when democratic change is becoming absolutely essential. And the democratization of our republic is becoming, I think, impossible to put on a long finger. It's not a process that's going to happen without struggle, without demands, without the creative engagement of the community. But I think we are at a point where Ireland is going to become ungovernable under its current structures of the state. And I would say this for three reasons. Firstly, one of the reasons that Ireland was so governable, even though it had a state that was very inward-looking and defensive, was because of cultural homogeneity, right? Particularly because of the church. The church acted as kind of an enormous force within society that could exercise authority, that could articulate values, that could impose all kinds of perceptions, which in some ways extremely negatively, in some ways very positively, but made the society work around some kind of consensus. The church's ability to do that is gone, right? Whatever form the churches take, it's not going to be that. The second reason I think change is inevitable is we had a thing called Fianna Fáil, which dominated the state for most of the history of the state. And whatever you think of Fianna Fáil, and some of my views on it are pretty well known, but it was incredibly good at operating the state. Right? It was absolutely brilliant at using the power of the state, doing it through building a kind of sense that you could connect everything up in the state. Right? You could connect the hospital porter who got his job because he was in Fianna Fáil up to the senior civil servant or the judge who got their jobs in some ways because they were one of us. That sense of one of us, that sense that there was, a wider community. I mean, Fianna Fáil never, if you call Fianna Fáil a political party, they always go crazy. So we're not a party, we're a movement, And it wasn't entirely untrue. Of course, it was self-serving and cynical, but there was some truth to it, which is that this was something which actually did operate in civil society and all the way up and all the way through, and therefore had a kind of continuity and a coherence to it, which could make the state work. It was very good at doing a kind of substitute divvying up of public resources, right? Particularly when resources were available. Of course, this is what the Celtic Tiger brought to the fine art. I mean, Bertie Ahern was the magician of that, the one for everything, everyone in the audience, bringing everybody in, trying, and of course civil society was even kind of brought into this process as much as possible. Everybody was brought in as much as possible. We'll give you something of what you want, so long as you
accept the parameters, and so long as you're not looking for any kind of redistribution of wealth or redistribution of power, but within this, they were actually very, very good at operating that system. And Fianna Fáil is not dead, but it's not going to be that anymore. Right? It's not going to be the dominant single movement that's going to be able to function in that way. And the third thing that's going to make democratic change happen is that we're actually kind of smart. The levels of education in our society have increased, exponentially, extraordinarily. Levels of connectedness, levels of knowledge about how things work have really grown hugely. Now, you could say, well, yeah, they've grown, but it hasn't led to any greater involvement in politics, and many of the smartest people are completely turned off by politics or public life. But it seems to me that there is an inevitability to public engagement in different ways. It may not happen in the old traditional ways, but I think there is a sense that Irish people have a higher and higher sense of collective self-esteem. We actually think quite highly of ourselves, sometimes quite wrongly. But it's better than the old collective sense of lack of self-worth. Maybe we've got over a sense of inferiority and have reached a point where Irish people's expectations of how their country is run are actually getting higher, and their lack of tolerance for the inability of the state to function at all sorts of levels, I think, is getting greater. So what I would suggest is that those three factors and maybe others are opening up a space for a new kind of democratic participation. They're opening up the possibility of really quite radical political reform in Ireland. And where would political reform in Ireland start? I've never been interested in starting it with the Seanad or it's all great or Dáil committees, it's all fine, yeah, absolutely. It has to start at the local level. The real problem in Irish democracy is we have no local democracy. We have local government. It's interesting, that's what we call it. We don't even call it local democracy. And yet, that's where our energies are. That's where our communities work. That's where our voluntary organisations work. That's where our civil society is in the local. So the best parts of our society are also the ones that are politically least represented, least connected to power. And if we're going to change the way the state operates, and if we're going to change the way civil society operates, it's that missing dimension of real local power where people actually can participate on a daily basis, on a weekly basis in decisions that affect their own communities. It's not something that's utopian or impossible. It's done in many, many other societies vastly better than we do it. But also, it's a movement which is growing around the world, participative democracy, where people actually get to engage in real decisions about how their own money is spent at a local level. Participatory budgets, for example, lots of cities now, for example, are doing their budgeting through participatory processes of citizens and of civil society. We can get there. We can actually fill in that gap. And I think if we do it, that's where the wires can start to connect, where the power of officialdom and bureaucracy and the state on the one side can actually be plugged back into the energy and creativity and solidarity and sense of social justice of our civil society. Maybe I'm naive, but I think when that happens, sparks will fly. I think there's a couple of institutional things. The dominance of the Department of Finance in the Irish state structure is absolutely extraordinary. So it really has enormous dominance. It's interesting. People always think that Sean Lemass, who did all that change, was Minister of Finance. He wasn't. He was Minister for Industry and Commerce. And probably wouldn't have done it if he was Minister of Finance. There's something about that department that it has always been arguing against change, arguing against risk. It always kind of has a mentality that it sees like this is our money and they're all out there trying to get their hands on it, and our job is to sort of keep them away. And of course, every state wants, you need a lot of really, really mean bean counters. They have to be there. They have to be, because, it is our money and we want it minded properly and all that. But that mentality seems to trump everything else. There's no creative tension around
well, actually, we do have to take some risks. We actually have to do some interesting things because the risk of doing nothing might now outweigh the risk of doing something. It's interesting, again, that free education didn't come. I mean, the Department of Finance fought tooth and nail against free second-level education in the 1960s. You know, we were one of the last developed countries to have free second-level education. The Department of Finance was still saying we can't afford it. It'll destroy the economy. It'll ruin the country. We can't do it. They argued against equal pay for women. Every single change that's happened to the Department of Finance has been there trying to stop it. Whittaker did come out of the Department of Finance, but remember when Whittaker in 1958 published Economic Development, it was published as a personal paper, right? Very deliberately. And the reason it was published as a personal paper was he was told to publish the personal paper so he would get the blame if it all went wrong, right? If everybody hated it and there was trouble. He was it was a personal problem. For him, it wasn't the Department of Finance saying, actually, people, we've got to think about this stuff, and it's very interesting. So that's a part of it. I think a part of it has to do with some of the cultures of the state. The culture of the state is incredibly legalistic and has become even more so. So we've ended up in a situation, we have a very good constitution in certain ways, but it's used increasingly and has been used really over the last 40, 50 years, as a kind of block on any sort of change. And the power of lawyers within the state, we've just seen it, by the way, very interestingly with the Legal Services Bill, being completely gutted. One of the key social changes and economic changes that needed to be made in Ireland that would have had really positive consequences for us was effectively the nationalisation of building land. This was proposed in the 1960s, well, at the end of the 1960s, actually in the early 70s. So we had a property bubble in the 1960s, right? A lot of the same stuff, they're not on the same scale, but nevertheless, it was very serious, happened. And as a result of it, there was a thing called the Kenny Commission set up to inquire into what was the problem with building lands. And it basically said what's happened is you have the hoarding of development land around Dublin in particular by a very small number of people, and they control that land. And they are therefore in a position to hugely inflate the price of building land, which in turn hugely inflates the price of property, which in turn then feeds this property bubble. And the Kenny report came out and said, this is what you have to do. What you have to do is you give to the local authorities the power to acquire the building land. You compensate at market levels. You set fair, what they said was 25% over the agricultural cost. So it's a good price. But the benefit of public decisions, zoning decisions, should belong to the public. These are public decisions. They should not benefit private individuals.
And that concludes the third in this series of public lectures from the Carmichael Centre here in North Brunswick Street in Dublin. We'd like to thank our guest speaker today, Fintan O'Toole. I'd also like to thank Diarmuid Ó Corbaoí, Ken Kilbride and all the wonderful staff here at the Carmichael Centre. And also thanks to John Kennedy for his help on sound. And so join us for the next lecture, where we'll hear from Director and Co-founder of Social Justice Ireland, Sean Healy. Till then, from everyone here at the Carmichael Centre and from me, Paul Maloney, goodbye.